protesting the fact that BP, the world's biggest oil company, sponsor the British Museum. They're doing this to launder their reputation. They want us to associate BP, a massive oil company that lobbies to make sure we stay on oil despite it wrecking our future. They want us to associate that company with nice days out at the museum and not with destroying the climate. That's why they sponsor these exhibitions here. But we're not just here to talk about the climate. We want to make the point that climate change is going to be extremely colonial in nature. It's going to hit the poorest of the world first and worst. And to talk more about that, I wanted to talk about this exhibition here. So this is the Ancient Iran exhibition at the British Museum. And BP has a lot of history in Iran. BP used to be called the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. It was set up in the early 20th century to extract oil from Iran, but it was set up by Western investors to make money for them, not for the Iranian people. In the 1950s, Iran elected its first democratic Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh. Mossadegh was elected on a platform of nationalising Iran's oil and building a social safety net for all Iranian people in the country. At that time, people lived in poverty, and yet the wealth of their nation was being extracted and taken straight to the West. But Mossadegh's nationalisation plans didn't go down well with BP at all. They'd lose a lot of cash if that happened. So what they did is they went to the United States and the UK, whose governments at the time were very used to overthrowing global South democracies, and they asked them, look, this guy in Iran, he wants to take our money, he wants to nationalise oil for his people or something, can you do something about that? And the United States organised a coup. The coup took away, they put Mossadegh under house arrest, and they brought in the Shah. The Shah of Iran is one of the world's most brutal dictators, well, he was one of the most brutal dictators of the 20th century. And yet people have these racist notions that the nations in the Middle East just aren't culturally suited to democracy. The fact is, Iran was a democracy. It was the West that killed it, and they killed it for oil. So I wanted to talk more about how that's had serious ramifications today for the Iranian people. So in 1979, there was the Iranian Revolution that overthrew the Shah and put in place this extreme right-wing Islamic theological government they have today. They are explicitly talking about how they will not be in the street protesting peacefully. They will be taking over, they'll be doing a violent revolution because they don't want to be couped like Mossadegh. The fact that they couped Mossadegh directly led to the cycles of violence which have impacted Iran to this day. My family had to flee the country in 1979 after the Islamic Revolution. And that fleeing has impacted my mum horrifically. My mum has never recovered from the fact she has barely visited her homeland after the age of 12. My grandma, the fact that Iran is now being sanctioned by the West as well, also impacts Iranians terribly. My grandma lives in Iran now. Medicine is scarce, food prices are through the roof because of Western sanctions that are impacting ordinary people. This is a very common story of constant colonialism. But what has this got to do with BP and the British Museum? Well, it is my generation across the world and in Iran who will suffer the climate chaos that BP's massive oil drilling and oil lobbying is locking into our future. The extraction activities of BP are not just warming the planet, they are part of climate colonialism. The poor of the world in Iran and elsewhere have been beaten down for centuries and in the cruelest of ways will also suffer the worst of climate impacts. So right now in Iran, like a few years ago we had water riots. People were rioting in a province in the south that was running out of water because of climate change. This century Iran will become fully uninhabitable. The good 80 million people that live there will have to move because of climate change, because of BP, and because of institutions that want to make BP out to be a nice institution, when it is one of the most dangerous institutions on the planet today. BP sponsors the exhibition so you can associate it with nice things, not the fact that they couped global South democracies in order to extract their oil and as a result are destroying the planet. I want to also talk about, interestingly, it's a funny fact that BP, such a colonial institution, chooses to sponsor the British Museum, because here is a great example of why the British Museum is also quite a colonial institution. That needs to change too. So this is the Cyrus cylinder. The Cyrus cylinder is an ancient Persian artefact. It's the world's first declaration of human rights. It was put in place by one of the ancient Persian kings when he conquered neighbouring Babylon. This Cyrus cylinder has been stolen from Iran. The Iranian government have been asking for it back for decades. The British Museum has been saying no. this should be given back. So we're here to ask, to demand that the British Museum drops BP sponsorship, stop laundering their reputation, it's doing us no good, and return stolen artefacts like the Cyrus cylinder which dot exhibitions across this building. This is just one small step the museum can take to close the divide between global north and global south and avoid brutal climate change that's in store for all of us if we don't do something about oil companies in our culture. Cool.
Thank you.